We are going to be talking about gun violence, he said, smiling. That is the wrong way to approach this. But we are searching for answers on gun violence today, political and otherwise. We're going to be talking with David Schultz about some of the political answers today, or at least where we might get politically with this. And we're going to start off by, though, focusing on the actual murderer in Las Vegas. We don't know a lot about Stephen Paddock. He was a mass murderer. We don't know why he did it. We got little bits of information that have been kind of trickling out. We know he set up a camera in his hotel room. We know that he was a gambler. We know lots of little weird things about him, but we don't know much about the reason he was doing this. So the question is, does this reveal anything about him? And is this what normal is the wrong word, but is this the profile of a mass killer? Joining us to examine these questions is Dr. David Henderson. He's a board-certified psychiatrist and the owner of Four Stones Collaborative Group in Dallas. Dr. Henderson, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's good to be on.
Good to have you here. Now, you're often called upon to be an expert witness in criminal cases. Now, obviously, we've never had a murder case with this many victims, but have you been called to testify in a case similar to this?
Well, I've done work in what we call forensic psychiatry, and of course the question is always when someone commits a crime, what is the motive? What was the desired purpose of the action? And I've found that even without any information about the individual, and kind of looking at his decision to make such an act or do such a thing, there are three main contributing factors. One is a sense of injustice. So the world is unfair. People have treated me poorly. I, therefore, am going to take action to make things right, and it's often in a harmful and destructive way. The second is a sense of meaninglessness, that my life has no value, no purpose, and therefore, in that frustration, I'm going to act in a way that generates that same confusion and angst and meaninglessness in other people's lives. And then the last is a feeling of helplessness or being trapped that leads someone to act in a very pathologically controlling way. And certainly lashing out in violence is something that maybe we've all experienced on a smaller level. If I, am working on my car and I accidentally scrape my hand, I'm going to potentially, if I don't think about it, throw the wrench or punch the wall or do something violent that really doesn't produce any value, but I still feel like I'm acting with control in a helpless situation. And so on a grand scale, that's a lot of times what individuals like this do. So even without any knowledge necessarily of the individual, when someone acts in such a way, those are the three main underlying factors that tend to contribute.
Now, so far, as I mentioned, we know very little about Stephen Paddock. I mean, his family has given interviews. His girlfriend has interviewed, and they've talked about some of the things that he was doing, that he was buying guns. He led a very secretive life. He changed jobs several times. He eventually got into real estate. All of these things are just facts. I don't know if they speak to his actual, where his brain was, where his mind was on this whole thing. When you look at what we've seen reported so far, do you see it matching just those 3 points that you talked about at all?
Well, we do know several things that stood out to me. One is that there is a family history of criminality. And the more that we study the human brain, the more that we see that actually criminality and what we call sociopathy or psychopathy is something that can have a genetic basis, and it can manifest physiologically in the brain. So the frontal lobes of the brain are really what house our executive decision-making abilities. And those areas have been dampened down in criminals as compared to normal controls. So there may be a genetic biological component. But also, if you think about family dynamics and you think about a person's upbringing and childhood, your view of the world and society is shaped from a very early age and from what you are exposed to. And we do know for a fact that this gentleman's childhood was very traumatic. His father was removed from the home at a very young age, and there were all sorts of problems that came as a result of that. We also know that the secrecy, the aspect that clearly there wasn't a whole lot of processing of what he was feeling emotionally or thinking based on at least what's being reported. And certainly when you're bottling up that kind of anger and agitation over an extended period of time, you're likely to explode at some point. And clearly there was, something going on there in terms of his agitation and anger. And then the fact that he recorded the entire incident. This is a person who wants to leave a legacy, wants to have a sense of significance. And I've said this before, if you don't believe that you can be the hero in your own life story, but you desire that significance, you might as well be the villain instead. And sometimes that's the route that people decide to go in situations like this.
We're speaking with Dr. David Henderson. He's a board-certified psychiatrist. We're talking about Stephen Paddock, a guy we don't know a lot about except that he went out and killed a lot of people in Las Vegas. And you mentioned a lot of different things here. And when I listen to all this stuff, I go, okay, I get that. I get this, the sense of injustice. I get the family history of criminality. I get the upbringing issues, and those all kind of mix into this. But then I'm asking, is there any way we can identify these people before they decide to become violent? Is there any way to do that systematically, that we can somehow live in a safer society? Because we have a society where we have guns, we have violent weapons that are available to a lot of people, and it's the wrong people getting a hold of those things is the problem, or at least part of the problem.
Well, I think in terms of profiling people, that's really kind of what you're talking about is looking at warning signs and then addressing them. It's a hard thing, and maybe it's going beyond sort of my ability to dictate policy on those kinds of things. But here's the issue: most of the people that come to see me are seeking help and desiring to have the attention taken to their mental health. And my attitude is that we need to be educating people as a society that it's okay to reach out and take care of your mental health. The problem that I see is there is still such a tremendous stigma surrounding needing help for mental struggles and issues. And the longer that we are silent about it, the more we avoid addressing the issue, the more we're going to have instances like this where people who have not gotten help, who have not been encouraged to reach out, act in these ways. So the conversation has to be brought up that how are we as a society fostering these individuals to remain in silence and continue to fester on these issues that have been boiling over for years and years and years, as opposed to reaching out and getting help. Look, I look at talk therapy and counseling as performance enhancement. A lot of people see it as taking someone who is broken and fixing them, but many of the clients that I see are very high-functioning, very successful individuals who value their own mental health. And if we as a society would work at valuing that, I think we'd see a lot of people opening up, reaching out, and not being so afraid and so ashamed of the stigma that's associated with it.
Now, let me give you a real big hypothetical. Let's say Stephen Paddock at some point in his life said, I need help. And he sat down with somebody like you or somebody else to do that. Is just the act of saying, I need help, the biggest step in trying to prevent something like this? Is that what I'm hearing here? Getting somebody on the road to actually dealing with their mental health issues?
It is probably the biggest step forward, taking that step and saying, I need help, and then being open and amenable to the help that is being offered. That is key, There's the old joke that says, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, it just takes one, but the light bulb has to want to change, right?
Right.
I mean, that's a funny way of illustrating the fact that you do have to have skin in the game and a desire to be teachable and engage and participate in the process. Certainly, I can help foster that as I engage individuals and confront the defenses that are often raised in talking about things that are uncomfortable. But the underlying willingness has to be there. And if it's not, then family members are often the ones initiating the therapy and setting the boundaries, saying, look, if you don't get help, then we will not engage you. We will not have a relationship with you. And so certainly I will encourage family members to set and establish healthy boundaries with their loved ones. And, that often then becomes the spark that motivates a person to reach out. And I can work with that. I can work with the resistance, but I'm here. I'm getting help because my family wants me to. Okay, let's start there and then move forward. But there's got to be some level of motivation in order for there to be change.
And it's that motivation. I mean, somebody could feel like, hey, my life, maybe it's not so great, but I know what I want to do. This guy obviously spent several months, if not years, planning and plotting to do something like this. So he had a goal in his life. That's after I think somebody's far gone. But if somebody's going to seek help, it seems like making that jump to saying, yeah, I need help is a hard one. And there's a lot of things that are kind of smaller things that are in the way. You've mentioned stigma. People, I'm not going to look strong. I'm not going to look macho. I'm going to look weak, whatever it may be for people. But I think there's a lot of other things that people worry about like this. They worry about, well, other people might find out, or I may find out things about me I don't like. Is that sometimes some of the reasons that people don't want to sit down and talk?
Oh, absolutely. We all have our own skeletons in the closets that we're ashamed of or that we're struggling with. And it's not just about being open and accepting everyone for who they are. I mean, clearly this man did something that I would describe as morally wrong and, heinous. And so, certainly if a person like this comes and shares that, he's having thoughts of homicide and, I'm very upfront with my clients that, I maintain confidentiality except in those instances where I'm concerned that you're a danger to yourself or a danger to someone else. However, if we can get to the heart of the issue and we can address the nature of what's driving it, then we can, create some very meaningful change in the process. So, that fear of opening up is significant, but, it's the price to pay. And I think we can do it, and we can find success in that transparency if we're willing to do so.
Now, in this particular case, Stephen Paddock's family, they came back and said, one brother, Patrick Paddock, said, my brother's the most boring one in the family. He was the least violent one over a 30-year history. So it's like, who? And what I'm hearing you say, it's not somebody who's violent that you need to worry about. It's somebody who's depressed and unhappy you need to worry about. And those are the things that we need to be looking for.
Well, yes, in the event that this man really was disturbed from a psychological, mental place, there's only one other explanation, and that is that he felt, that he was enacting some, vengeful plot, or even that if it wasn't vengeance, it was some, relationship to a higher organization. And of course, that's all conspiracy theory stuff at this point. But, if indeed he was disturbed, which I believe obviously he was, then, that is the case. The person who is struggling with depression or anxiety or anger issues, those are not necessarily people who are going to do harmful things, but they may not be open about the struggle and addressing. I think that's the key issue, is the level of openness and teachability that someone has. You can be depressed, you can be anxious, you can be angry, but have a teachable spirit and be willing to be held accountable for those feelings and emotions. That's where success is going to come. The danger is really in those who refuse to open up and engage. And clearly we can't ever predict what someone is going to do if we don't have the information. Now, the brother is saying that there were no signs. That is still yet to be determined based on the evidence that's being explored. But if we take at face value what the brother is saying, then we have someone who is clearly extremely isolated, very shut in, and very closed off to the rest of society.
And just to kind of take it back to your 3 points you started us out with here, we were talking about depression. Those 3 points, a sense of injustice, my life has no value, I'm feeling helpless, those aren't necessarily meaning that somebody is depressed, or is that depression needs to be part of that equation to get to that place?
No, absolutely not. You don't have to be depressed or even have a clinically diagnosable psychiatric condition to be struggling with those 3 elements. The question was posed, once before to me is this guy must be clearly mentally ill in order to have done the things that he did. And I would take a stance against that. I would say that someone can be completely sane and act in such a way, but still struggling and wrestling with those 3 elements. It actually does, I think, a disservice to those who are struggling with mental illness to lump someone like this into that category without having all the facts. Could he have been mentally ill? Absolutely. But he may have been completely sane, knowing exactly what he was doing, knowing the moral reality of his decisions, and acting with complete competence moving forward. And we certainly can't rule that out at this point.
And we said you often do what's called forensic work here. In this particular case, there is no mass murderer to interview. He's gone. The people working on this case, can they make a determination, you think, at one point why he did it, or is it possible we may never know?
I mean, it's real. The reality is we may never know without having, the evidence, or even if he was still alive. In interviewing him, it would be hard to know unless there's some sort of evidence that he left behind, some documentation or attribution to the decision-making process. We may never know the decision, but certainly we can know in a general sense why people act in such a way, and we can be looking for those signs of people who, are contemplating these things based on their attitudes and their perspective. And that's why we need to maintain an open conversation with the people around us in our lives. We live in a very isolated society. You'd think we were super connected as a whole because of social media, but I've found that we've become more isolated because of this false sense of connection. Many of us don't even know our own neighbors or, take the time to interact with the people right next door because we're so focused in our small little worlds. If we would take the time to become more community interested and have a community sense of responsibility, that's where we're going to prevent more of these things from happening.
We've been speaking with Dr. David Henderson, a board-certified psychiatrist. He's the owner of Four Stones Collaborative Group in Dallas. He's been nice enough to take some time with us today to talk about Stephen Paddock, the killer in Las Vegas, and trying to figure out why did he do it. And as he just said, we may never know. Dr. Henderson, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.